Question number 1, Kezia Dugdale.
To ask the First Minister what engagement she has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, given that today is World Cancer Day, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our health and social care staff and those in the third sector who work tirelessly to deliver our cancer services. I know that everyone in this chamber is acutely aware of the devastating impact that cancer has on people here at home and across the world, and therefore I think it's important for all of us to mark World Cancer Day 2016. Later today, I have engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Kezia Dugdale.
Can I start by associating myself with the First Minister's remarks in their entirety? Last night, the First Minister voted against Labour's plans to use the powers of this Parliament to stop cuts to education and to vital local public services. The SNP and the Tories stood shoulder to shoulder to impose hundreds of millions of pounds of cuts on schools and communities. It goes against everything the First Minister has ever told us that she stands for. Because last year she said, "We will use the powers we have in the Scottish Parliament to pursue a different approach." And she promised to halt the deeply misguided march to further austerity. Yesterday, Nicola Sturgeon had the chance to stop school budgets being slashed and thousands of people losing their jobs. Why didn't she take it?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer,
First Minister, order. First
in this
Minister.
chamber we have a Labour Party that wants to increase taxes for the low and middle income earners. We have a Tory Party that wants to cut taxes for high earners. They're both wrong and they're as bad as each other. Presiding Officer, last night I and my colleagues voted against a proposal that would have seen every single person in Scotland earning above £11,000 a year pay more tax. That, Presiding Officer, is a fact, whether Labour like it or not. And in doing so, you could argue that I was only following the advice of Kezia Dugdale herself, who stood up at her party conference last October and said this: "A fairer Scotland isn't one where everyone pays more tax. We must stop tax rises on working families." So, Presiding Officer, I'll concentrate on protecting our vital public services and delivering pay rises for people across Scotland. I'll leave the Labour Party to defend why somebody on £11,000 a year should be paying more tax.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
Of course, Presiding Officer, it wasn't just shoulder to shoulder in the chamber that she stood with the Tories yesterday. It was in the newspapers this week, using phrases like tax grab and punitive tax rises. What about punitive service cuts? What about punitive job losses? She imposed £500 million worth of cuts on local communities across Scotland yesterday. And you know, it is always the same with the SNP. It can't be done. We don't have the power. The same pathetic excuses we heard when they were pressed on tax credits. And the reality is this: it can be done, and we do have the power. The budget process has a long way to go. We can still stop these SNP cuts to schools. At the stroke of a pen, the First Minister could stop hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cuts and thousands of job losses. She says education has been protected, but it was revealed this week that spending on children in our primary schools has been cut by £561 per child since she was re-elected, and that's before the latest round of cuts. If she won't stop cuts to local school budgets, how on earth can she claim that education is her priority?
First First Minister.
Presiding Officer.
First Minister.
Just in point of fact, total revenue spending on schools has risen under this SNP government by at least £208 million, or 4.5%. That is the reality. But let's just focus. Let's hear the First Minister. Kezia Dugdale is proposing. Local authorities in the next financial year are facing a reduction of £350 million, offset by an investment in social care of £250 million. So instead of saying to local authorities, let us work together to find 1% reduction in a budget of £15 billion, Labour wants to increase tax for every single person in Scotland earning above £11,000. That's the reality. And let me just spell it out to Kezia Dugdale, what that means to a public sector worker. Somebody working in our NHS right now, earning £21,000, is looking forward to a £100 increase in their minimum pay rise as a result of John Swinney's decision. That minimum pay rise will go up from £300 to £400 in April. Every single penny of that extra £100 will be taken away by Labour's proposal. Or as Gordon Brown once said, there's hardly a nurse, teacher, policeman or council worker who won't be hit hard by an increase in the basic rate of tax. So we will continue to take the decisions, even although the Tories are cutting our budget, to protect our NHS, to invest in social care, to pay a living wage to every social care worker in our country, to maintain teachers in our schools and invest in attainment, and to protect household budgets. I'll leave Labour to defend why low-paid workers in this country should pay Labour's extra tax.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
Every one of those arguments she just deployed were the words from David Cameron at Prime Minister's questions yesterday. Every one of them. It's true. And she stands there and says that Labour's plans are unfair and unworkable. So she should explain why union after union has come out over the past few days to say that they're fair, and council leader after council leader has come out and said that they are workable. In the limelight of the general election, Nicola Sturgeon sent a reassuring message to voters in England. She said, "We will demand an alternative to slash and burn austerity." Well, let's take a look at what one of her old advisers had to say about that today. Alex Bell said, "That's one of their own."
Order.
That's one of their own.
Continue. Let's hear Ms Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
Alex Bell said, "If you spend your life shouting fire, fire, at some point you have to use the extinguisher. If not, then you just look like an arsonist." The First Minister, who built her celebrity on being the anti-austerity alternative, is now leading the attack on the only alternative to austerity. Yeah. Faced with the choice between using the powers of this Parliament and hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cuts, why did the First Minister choose austerity?
Well, do you know what?
First Minister. Order. Let's hear the First Minister.
Tax rises on the lowest paid in our society is not tackling. Tax.
Sit down. There's far too much shouting across the chamber. Please let us hear the First Minister, and please let us hear Ms Dugdale. First Minister.
Tax rises on the lowest paid in our society is not standing up to Tory austerity. It is transferring the burden of Tory austerity onto the shoulders who can least afford it. Now, Kezia Dugdale wants to trade advisers. Well, let me give her one, because I was struck by the comment earlier this week by an economist commenting directly on Kezia Dugdale's proposal when she said she disagreed with them. And she said, tax rises is just, and I quote, another name for austerity. That economist was Anne Pettifor. She is a member of Jeremy Corbyn's Economic Advisory Committee. That is her view. Labour not proposing an alternative to Tory austerity, but transferring the burden and proposing austerity by another name. Do you know, Presiding Officer, we wouldn't.
Order!
The reality here, and this is the reality that Scottish Labour cannot and never will escape. We wouldn't be facing Tory cuts right now if they hadn't campaigned with the Tories to keep us locked in to Tory cuts. I see Ian Gray sitting next to Kezia Dugdale.
Order.
Let me remind Scotland what Ian Gray told the people of Scotland before the referendum. If Scotland was independent, then John Swinney would have to increase taxes. Well, thanks to Labour, the Tories are in charge of our budget, and now we've got Labour proposing an increase in taxes. They are an utter disgrace.
Kezia Dugdale. Miss Dugdale. Miss Dugdale. Let's hear Miss Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, experts from Stirling University, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the House of Commons Library, SPICE, they all say that Labour's policy is fair because the poorest are protected and the richest pay the most. And this matters. This matters because Nicola Sturgeon has built her career telling us that more powers would mean fewer cuts. Yet she refuses to use the powers when it really matters. She has staked her reputation on improving education, yet she cuts school budgets rather than using those powers. She has sold herself as the radical alternative to Tory austerity, but yesterday she sold out the people who needed her the most. This was the week Nicola Sturgeon was found out. People across Scotland are left asking, with all her power, why couldn't the First Minister just do the right thing?
First Minister. First Minister.
There is a difference here, Presiding Officer. Clearly, Kezia Dugdale thinks that making somebody earn £11,000 a year pay the price of Tory austerity is the right thing to do. I don't. I think giving people like that a pay rise, getting them onto the living wage, that's the right thing to do. Now, Kezia Dugdale says that her proposals are fair. She can't explain any of the detail of her proposals, as we saw very clearly from Jackie Baillie. You know, apparently the rebate, which is a total con, has all been worked out. I don't even know if Kezia Dugdale knows how much it costs to administer housing and council tax benefit schemes every year. £41 million for a scheme that caters for 500,000 applicants. And yet we're expected to believe from Labour that a scheme that would have to deal with 1 million applicants is going to be done for £1 million. It is absolute incompetence. And lastly, she says her proposals are fair. Well, under Labour's proposals, the amount of tax I paid would go up by 2.7%. The amount of tax that a nurse, a teacher, a care worker would pay would go up by 5%. Presiding Officer, that is not fair in the slightest. So I'll leave Labour to argue for tax rises for the low-paid to compensate for the Tory cuts that they kept us locked into. I'll continue to argue for fairness, for pay rises, for protection for our public services. That is the difference between us.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when she'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans at present.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, let's try this from a different angle. The new powers that are coming to this Parliament have already changed the debate in Scotland. The Labour Party is going into this election threatening to put up taxes for every worker in Scotland. The Lib Dems are also going into this election threatening to put up taxes for every worker in Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives want to protect people's paychecks and believe workers in Scotland should not have to pay more than those in the rest of the UK, and will also try to lower taxes when it is affordable to do so. But the SNP alone keep us guessing. No tax rises this year, but who knows after that? So can I ask the First Minister for a straight answer? Does she believe that Scottish workers, no matter which end of the pay scale they're on, should never have to pay more tax here than they would do elsewhere in the UK?
First Minister.
Well, actually, just for completeness, the Tories are actually going into this election also arguing for more tax on low-paid people, because they're going to bring back prescription charges for people on low pay. They're going to make people pay for their education. So let's not pretend that the Tories aren't proposing some pretty hefty tax rises as well. The difference, of course, is that they also want to cut taxes for people at the highest end of the income scale. So I'll continue to argue for fairness. We'll put forward, in advance of this election, the sensible policies, Presiding Officer, that protect our public services and protect household incomes. We reject the approach of Labour, we reject the approach of Tories, and you know what? Probably so will Scotland.
Ruth Davidson.
Looks like we're going to have to wait a wee while for a proper answer, Presiding Officer. Yeah. Now, of course, a lot of the decisions that we're talking about here do hang on a successful conclusion of the talks between our two governments on the sustainable fiscal framework. I believe that there is an agreement to reach, and I believe that it's in the interests of both governments and, more importantly, on the interests of the people of Scotland. The Secretary of State for Scotland has made it clear that no arbitrary deadline should be set to cut these discussions short. People need to know ahead of the election what they're voting for. The talks should continue beyond the artificial February deadline if extra time is needed to hammer out a deal. Doesn't the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
It's up to this Parliament to decide the amount of time that this Parliament needs to scrutinise any deal that's agreed. I want to see a deal agreed as quickly as possible, and we will do everything we can to reach that deal, because I want these new powers, however limited they might be. I want to have them. But let me tell you this, Presiding Officer, and maybe this is the difference between me and Ruth Davidson. I'm going to stand up for Scotland in these talks. I will not accept a deal that gives Scotland more powers, but only at a big cost to our budget. So if Ruth Davidson wants a deal as well, can I suggest she gets onto the phone to her colleagues today and tells them to stop arguing for a deal that would strip billions of pounds out of Scotland's budget?
Constituency question, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. The First Minister should be aware of the anger and dismay felt this morning by 5 businesses on being told it will now be mid-March before the Forth Road Bridge will fully reopen to HGVs. She will recall we were promised full reopening of the bridge, first in early January, then in mid-February. Now we're being told in mid-March. What confidence can we have that this new date will in fact be met, given the 2 previous deadlines were not met? And given the ongoing losses being suffered by 5 businesses, what more assistance can the Scottish Government offer them?
First Minister.
Well, obviously, as Murdo Fraser and everybody else knows, the bridge is open and has been open since before Christmas to 90% of all traffic. What was announced this morning is that there will now be a partial reopening of the bridge to HGVs, so that, weather permitting, overnight, a limited number, but nevertheless some HGVs will be allowed to cross the bridge. There has been a delay to the full completion of the works, partly down to what I hope everybody would recognise, the weather conditions, particularly the high winds that we've been facing, but also the need to do some further strengthening to particular parts of the bridge. And that is why the mid-March date has been given by the Transport Minister today. There is some contingency built into that to take account for possible bad weather conditions over the next few weeks. So we're working hard to get the bridge fully reopened to all HGVs, but also to facilitate as much traffic across the bridge as we can. And we will continue, as we have been doing, to work with the haulage industry to support them as much as we possibly can during this period.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Matters of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
Can I start on a rare point of consensus? She's right about the Conservatives. They have £140 million worth of stealth taxes planned, as the hole in their budget plans quite reveals. But the point with the First Minister is that she has choices, but the SNP is imposing cuts on schools and council services. She's strong-armed councils into making the cuts, with fines if they fail to obey her, and she is refusing to use the income tax powers she now has, no longer leading, frozen to the spot, incapable of protecting our once proud Scottish education system. Instead of blaming everyone else, will she step up and use the powers that she's now got?
First Minister.
Do you know, I am really surprised that Willie Rennie can bring himself to look a single Scottish voter in the eye. You know, I'm just going to remind Willie Rennie of what he was telling people in Scotland just a year or so ago. And this is a direct quote. The Liberal Democrats in the UK government, and just to remind them that was in coalition with the Conservatives, are building a stronger economy here in Scotland with lower taxes. This is what the broad UK shoulders enable us to deliver. So having misled the Scottish people that the only way to avoid tax rises was to vote no, he now turns round and tells people that they have to pay higher taxes anyway. Higher taxes to pay for the cuts that his party has helped the Tories impose on us for the last 5 years. Willie Rennie, presiding officer, should be utterly ashamed of himself. He should be begging the Scottish people for forgiveness, not handing out sanctimonious lectures to the rest of us on how to deal with...
Order!
Not handing out lectures to the rest of us on how to deal with Tory cuts that he bears so much responsibility for.
Willie Rennie?
There she goes again, blaming absolutely everyone else. And can I remind her that the Liberal Democrats that cut taxes for those on low and middle incomes, tax cuts that she opposed. She opposed in this chamber, she opposed in Westminster. She is not interested in those on low and middle incomes. It's all about posturing, and it's all about blaming everyone else and never accepting responsibility herself. The First Minister has not grasped this properly.
Mr Stewart.
The First Minister has not grasped this properly. We can choose to invest £475 million to have a transformational effect on our education system. We can stop the cuts to schools, repair the cuts that the SNP have opposed on our colleges, expand nursery education and invest in a pupil premium. With a penny for education, we can give every child the chance to get on, provide the skills for our economic progress and get Scotland's education back to the world's best. Does she not see the opportunity in any of that?
First Minister.
We are protecting our National Health Service. We are investing in social care. We're paying a living wage to every social care worker in our country. We're maintaining the number of teachers in our schools. We're investing in improving attainment. And we're protecting household budgets. Because unlike Willie Rennie, I don't think people on incomes as low as £11,000 a year should be paying more tax to compensate for the Tory cuts that he helped the Tories impose on us in the first place. Now, I know that Willie Rennie is desperate to forget the 5 years when he and his party propped up the Conservatives in government. But you know what? The Scottish people are not going to forget the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. If it's possible for Willie Rennie to sink any lower in the coming election, he sure as hell is going to do it.
Mr MacArthur and Mr Hume, that's just enough. Question number 4, Rod Campbell.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the review of NHS drug assessments.
First Minister.
I'm pleased that Dr Brian Montgomery has agreed to undertake an independent review of the Scottish Medicines Consortium's assessment processes. Dr Montgomery's review will help us to take forward further reforms in the access to new medicines, building on the positive progress achieved already. While the SMC's reforms in 2014, together with other reforms and our own £90 million New Medicines Fund, have already benefited more than 1,000 families through access to life-saving and life-extending drugs, we want to ensure the assessment system continues to evolve to deliver effectively for patients and the NHS.
Rod Campbell.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. I welcome this review. And I also welcome the 26 new medicines that have been approved under the new system. However, in 2014, the then Cabinet Secretary, when announcing the proposals, indicated that it was anticipated that new medicines would be made available quicker. Can the First Minister advise whether the review will evaluate that and consider how timescales could be improved further for the many patients for whom these drugs are a lifeline?
First Minister.
The overarching aim of the review is about providing safe and timely access to clinically effective medicines at a fair price. We think there are improvements that can still be made, such as working with the pharmaceutical industry to get their best offering on price earlier than sometimes happens at the moment. So that will be one of the issues that the review takes account of. And all of this is about making sure that these often very difficult decisions about access to drugs are taken as fairly as possible, and that we get as many people as possible accessing life-saving and life-extending drugs.
Question number 5, Patricia Ferguson.
Ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to stop deaths from breast cancer.
First Minister.
Well, we recently announced a £450,000 joint partnership with Breast Cancer Now, which will allow for more Scottish-led research into breast cancer development to take place, helping to further enhance our knowledge and treatment of the disease. In addition, our £39 million Detect Cancer Early programme is focused on diagnosing cancer at an earlier stage when chances of survival are higher and helping save more lives every year. Currently, the number of people in Scotland living for at least 5 years after a cancer diagnosis has reached a record high. We're also committed to publishing a new cancer strategy to ensure real improvements are made to services, and we're currently working with stakeholders and patients to develop this by spring of this year, and this will include further investment in cancer services.
Patricia Ferguson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. The First Minister will be aware that the 2050 Challenge campaign launched this week by Breast Cancer Now. And as a breast cancer survivor myself, I know how crucial this campaign is. But I am one of the lucky ones. The First Minister will have seen earlier this week Colin Leslie's heartbreaking account of the loss of his fiancée Sharon from breast cancer. No one should have to go through what he has, but thousands will, and for years to come, if we don't act now. So will the First Minister agree to meet with me, with Colin and with other campaigners to discuss how the Scottish Government can further support efforts to stop women and men from dying from breast cancer by 2050?
First Minister.
Yes, and can I thank Patricia Ferguson for her question and obviously acknowledge the personal experience she brings to bear to this issue. I'm happy to meet with her and with campaigners. This is something we have to work together on. If we are going to tackle not just breast cancer but all cancers and improve survival rates, then we need to do more, as we are seeking to do, to detect cancer earlier. I know, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying, my colleague Richard Lochhead's wife has been very bravely in the last few weeks and months raising the issue of checking and acting on early signs. So that's important, but it's also important that we have the best cancer services to treat people as effectively as possible, and to go back to the previous question, that we give people access to life-saving or life-extending drugs as often as possible. This is something we all desperately want to see real progress on. There is, I'm sure, not a single one of us in this chamber who hasn't in some way, shape or form experienced the devastation of cancer. And I am committed to making sure that we do everything we can to make progress, and I'd be delighted to have the expertise of Patricia Ferguson to help us with that.
Question number 6, Jimmy Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what recent discussions the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government regarding the fiscal framework.
First Minister.
Deputy First Minister met the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on Monday to continue negotiations, and they will meet again on Monday coming. My position on this remains the same and remains as it was in my answer to Ruth Davidson. I want Scotland to get additional powers, the additional powers we were promised, but they should not come at a cost to Scotland's budget. I will not, as First Minister, sign up to a deal that is detrimental to Scotland, nor will I ask the Parliament to approve the Scotland Bill if a fair fiscal framework has not been agreed. There remain significant differences in our views, but the Scottish Government is determined to ensure that we secure a deal that is consistent with the intentions of the Smith Commission and delivers fairness for Scotland now and in the future. Jimmy Day.
The First Minister will be aware that the Smith Commission and the Devolution Further Powers Committee of this Parliament both agreed that the fiscal framework which will underpin the new powers coming to Parliament must not be to Scotland's detriment. Therefore, will the First Minister give a clear commitment that any government that she leads will never shortchange the people of Scotland, and certainly not to the tune of £3.5 billion over the next decade, as is currently being proposed by the UK Treasury?
First Minister.
Well, the whole point of the Smith Commission proposals was to give us powers and for us then to bear the risk and indeed reap the benefits of our decisions to use these powers. There should be no detriment to Scotland now or in the future simply from the transfer of these powers, and that's at the heart of the discussions about the block grant adjustment. I should say there are still other issues to be resolved in these discussions, but that is the issue at the heart of the block grant adjustment. So we will not sign up to any agreement or any deal that would see billions of pounds, or any money for that matter, taken out of Scotland's budget, regardless of the decisions that this government takes. We will not sell Scotland short, but we will continue to work as hard as we possibly can to get a deal that is fair for everyone.
Thank you. Before I end First Minister's questions, can I just say this to all members? Some of the behaviour in the Chamber today has been quite unacceptable. Can I suggest that members review the footage of First Minister's questions and consider whether they showed themselves in this Parliament in the best light? That ends First Minister's questions. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the Chamber should do so quickly and quietly.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.